The sun beat down on Sarah's back as she hauled another bucket of water from the well. Dust devils danced across the parched fields, mocking her efforts to keep her small farm alive. Her husband, Thomas, had been gone for 2 years now, taken by a fever that swept through their isolated settlement. He'd been a good man, a strong man, but the land hadn't been kind to them, even together. Now, alone, it felt like a constant battle against nature itself. Each day was a rhythm of chores, tending to the chickens, milking the cow, weeding the small vegetable garden that provided their meager meals. The nearest town was a hard day's ride away, too far to rely on for help. Sarah had learned to mend fences, fix tools, and even deliver her own cow's calf when the time came. She had to. There was no one else. The evenings were the hardest. The silence of the empty farmhouse pressed in on her, filled only with the creaks and groans of the old wood. Sometimes she'd read by the dim light of a kerosene lamp, losing herself in stories of faraway lands and grand adventures, a stark contrast to her own quiet, isolated existence. Other times, she'd just sit on the porch, watching the stars blaze across the inky sky, remembering Thomas and the dreams they had shared. Dreams of a family, of a bountiful harvest, of a life built together on this unforgiving land. She clutched a worn photograph of Thomas, tucked inside her apron pocket. His smiling face, a reminder of the love she had lost and the strength she needed to carry on. Sarah wasn't a delicate flower. She was a sturdy weed, growing where she was planted, determined to survive, no matter the odds. The West demanded toughness, and Sarah had plenty of it. She would endure. She had to. The quiet of the evening was shattered by a distant but unmistakable sound, gunfire. Sarah froze, her hand still on the latch of the chicken coop. The sound was coming from the north, towards the Henderson Ranch, about 5 miles away. It was a sound she had dreaded, a sound that spoke of danger and violence. Apache raids were not uncommon in this part of the territory, though they usually targeted larger settlements or supply trains. Isolated farms like hers were often spared, considered too insignificant to bother with. But that didn't mean she was safe. Her heart pounded in her chest as she strained to hear more. The sporadic gunfire intensified, punctuated by the high-pitched war cries that sent shivers down her spine. She knew what those cries meant: chaos, destruction, and death. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped her. She quickly secured the chickens, her movements jerky and hurried. She glanced towards the house, her sanctuary, but it suddenly felt vulnerable, exposed. She remembered the stories Thomas had told her about the Apache, fierce warriors who knew the land better than anyone. They were fighting for their survival, for their way of life, against the relentless encroachment of settlers. Thomas, though a farmer, had always spoken of them with a grudging respect. But respect wouldn't stop a bullet. Sarah hurried inside, bolting the door and barricading the windows with heavy wooden shutters. She grabbed the rifle Thomas had left behind, a heavy Winchester that felt unfamiliar and cumbersome in her hands. She knew how to use it, of course. Thomas had taught her, but she had never fired it in anger, never had to defend herself against a real threat. She peered through a crack in the shutters, her eyes scanning the horizon. The sky was darkening, and the wind was picking up, carrying the scent of smoke and the faint echo of screams. The raid was getting closer. Or perhaps her fear was simply magnifying the sounds, making them seem closer than they were. Either way, Sarah knew she had to be ready. She was alone, and her survival depended on her own courage and resourcefulness. The storm broke with a fury. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rattled the small house. Sarah huddled in the corner, the rifle clutched tightly in her hands. The sounds of the raid had faded, replaced by the roar of the storm, but her fear remained. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was still in danger. As dawn began to break, painting the sky in shades of gray and purple, the storm began to subside. Sarah, exhausted and tense, cautiously opened the door. The air was cool and damp, and the farm was eerily quiet. She ventured out, her eyes scanning the surroundings. A broken fence post here, a scattering of debris there, signs of the storm's passing. Then she saw it, a dark shape huddled against the side of her barn. She raised a rifle, her heart pounding in her chest once more. As she drew closer, she realized it was a man, an Apache. He was lying on the ground, his clothes soaked and torn, a dark stain spreading across his shoulder. He was wounded. Sarah hesitated. He was one of the raiders, one of the people who had brought fear and violence to her doorstep. She should leave him there, let him fend for himself. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the sight of his pain. Maybe it was the memory of Thomas, who had always helped those in need, regardless of who they were. Lowering the rifle slightly, she approached him cautiously. He was young, barely more than a boy, with strong features and long, black hair matted with rain. He was unconscious. After a moment of internal debate, Sarah made her decision. She couldn't leave him to die. He was a human being, and he needed help. She carefully dragged him into the barn, out of the rain and wind. His name, she would later learn, was Conthi, and her life would never be the same again. The barn was dark and smelled of hay and manure, a far cry from a doctor's office. But it was the best Sarah could offer. She cleaned Conthi's wound with water from her well, her hands trembling slightly. The bullet had passed clean through his shoulder, thankfully, but it still needed tending. She used a clean cloth and some of the medicinal herbs she grew in her garden, herbs Thomas had taught her about, to pack the wound. Each touch was a risk, each movement a gamble. If anyone found out she was harboring an Apache, she would be ostracized, maybe even arrested. But she couldn't bring herself to abandon him. She had seen too much death, too much suffering, to turn her back on someone in need, even if he was her enemy. As she worked, she studied his face. He was so young, his features hardened by pain and hardship, but still possessing a certain innocence. What had driven him to become a raider? Or his dreams, his hopes, his fears? She knew so little about the Apache, only what she had heard from others, stories filled with prejudice and fear. She bandaged his shoulder tightly, hoping it would stop the bleeding. He stirred slightly, moaning softly in his sleep. She placed a cool cloth on his forehead, her touch gentle. She knew she was taking a huge risk, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of compassion for this wounded young man. For the next few days, Sarah nursed Conthi in secret, bringing him food and water, changing his bandages, and praying that he would recover. She spoke to him in soft whispers, even though she knew he couldn't understand her words. She told him about Thomas, about her life on the farm, about her hopes for the future. It was as if she needed to share her story with someone, even if that someone was an unconscious Apache raider. The act of caring for him, despite the danger, filled a void in her lonely existence, giving her a purpose beyond mere survival. The rhythmic creak of the rocking chair transported Sarah back. It wasn't so long ago, really, but it felt like a lifetime. Thomas had been coughing, a dry, hacking cough that wouldn't quit. At first, they thought it was just a bad cold, but it worsened despite Sarah's best efforts with homemade remedies. He grew weaker, his breathing labored, his skin flushed with fever. They were too far from town to fetch a doctor quickly. Sarah had tried everything she knew, nursing him day and night, but the illness was relentless. She remembered the fear that had clawed at her throat, the helplessness that had consumed her as she watched the man she loved slowly slip away. The nearest neighbors, the Millers, had helped as much as they could, but they had their own farm to run, their own family to care for. And the illness was contagious. Fear kept most people away. Sarah was largely alone, forced to watch Thomas suffer, to comfort him as best she could, knowing deep down that she was losing him. She remembered the day he died, the silence that had fallen over the small farmhouse after his last breath, a silence that had been deafening, crushing. The weight of the world had settled on her shoulders that day, the realization that she was alone, truly alone, in this vast and unforgiving land. She had buried him beneath the old oak tree at the edge of their property, a simple wooden cross marking his grave. The other settlers had come to pay their respects, but their condolences felt hollow, their offers of help fleeting. They had their own lives to live, their own struggles to face. After the funeral, Sarah had made a decision. She would not remarry. She would not leave the farm. She would honor Thomas's memory by making a life for herself on the land they had both loved. She would learn to do everything herself, to be strong and self-reliant, so that she would never again be dependent on anyone else. That was why she was so isolated, so determined. The death of Thomas had forged her into the woman she was today, a survivor. Kanthi regained consciousness slowly. His eyes, dark and intense, flickered around the barn, taking in his surroundings. He tensed when he saw Sarah, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through his shoulder, forcing him back down. Sarah approached cautiously, holding out a bowl of broth. "Easy," she said softly, her voice calm and reassuring. "You're safe here. I helped you." Kanthi stared at her, suspicion etched on his face. He didn't understand her words, but he understood the gesture. He cautiously took the bowl, his eyes never leaving hers. He sipped the broth slowly, his gaze unwavering. Over the next few days, as Kanthi regained his strength, a fragile communication began to develop between them. Sarah used gestures, pointing to objects and naming them. "Water," she would say, holding up a canteen. "Food," she would say, offering him a piece of bread. Kanthi, in turn, would point to himself and say Kanthi. He knew a few words of English, learned from encounters with traders and soldiers. Sarah, in turn, tried to learn a few words of his language, listening intently to his pronunciation and mimicking the sounds. It was a slow and clumsy process, filled with misunderstandings and laughter. Sarah learned that Kanthi was a skilled hunter and warrior, proud of his heritage and fiercely loyal to his people. He spoke of the beauty of the land, the importance of family, and the injustice of the white man's encroachment on their territory. Sarah, in turn, told him about her life on the farm, about Thomas, about her dreams for the future. She showed him the photograph of Thomas, and he nodded respectfully, understanding the pain of loss. She showed him her garden, and he marveled at the variety of plants she cultivated. Slowly, tentatively, they began to bridge the gap between their cultures, finding common ground in their shared humanity. The barn, once a place of fear and suspicion, became a space of understanding and connection. The uneasy peace was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. She peeked through a crack in the barn door and saw them. 3 men, dressed in dusty clothes, their faces grim and hardened. They were heavily armed, rifles slung across their backs, pistols strapped to their hips. Bounty hunters. She knew what they were after, the Apache raiders who had attacked the Henderson Ranch. And she knew that they wouldn't hesitate to search every inch of her property. She had to warn Kanthi, to hide him before it was too late. She turned to find Kanthi already watching her, his eyes filled with a knowing dread. He had heard the horses too. He understood the danger. There was no time for explanations. She grabbed his arm and pulled him towards the back of the barn, toward the hidden storage area behind the hay bales. "Hide," she whispered urgently, pushing him inside. "Stay quiet. Don't make a sound." Kanthi nodded, his face tight with determination. He disappeared into the shadows, blending seamlessly with the darkness. Sarah quickly rearranged the hay bales, hoping to conceal the entrance to the storage area. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. It was too late to move him to the house. The bounty hunters were already dismounting their horses. She walked out of the barn, trying to appear calm and nonchalant. As she approached the men, she forced a smile. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts. The leader of the group, a tall, gaunt man with a grizzled beard, stared at her with cold, assessing eyes. "We're looking for Apache," he said, his voice rough and gravelly. "Heard they came through here after the raid on the Henderson Ranch." Sarah swallowed hard, trying to maintain her composure. "I haven't seen any Apache," she said, her voice steady. "I'm just a widow, living here alone." The bounty hunter narrowed his eyes, unconvinced. "We'll see about that," he said, and motioned to his men. "Search the place." The bounty hunters ransacked the barn, tossing hay bales aside, poking around in the animal stalls, their movements rough and disrespectful. Sarah watched, her stomach churning with anxiety. Conthi was hidden well, but the bounty hunters were thorough. It was only a matter of time before they found him. After a fruitless search of the barn, the leader turned his attention to the house. "All right, widow," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Let's see what you're hiding inside." Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't let them search the house. Conthi, weakened from his wound, wouldn't stand a chance against 3 armed men. She had to do something, anything to protect him. Thinking quickly, she said, "There's nothing in the house. I swear, it's just a simple dwelling, not fit for hiding anyone." The bounty hunter smirked. "We'll be the judge of that." Desperate, Sarah blurted out the first thing that came to her mind. "He's sick. There's a fever going around. I wouldn't want you gentlemen to catch anything." The bounty hunter hesitated, a flicker of concern in his eyes. Disease was a real threat in these parts. But he quickly recovered. "We'll take our chances," he said, and pushed past her towards the door. Sarah knew she was out of options. She couldn't physically stop them. She had to get Conthi out of the barn and into the house, where she might have a chance to protect him. She stalled for time, arguing with the bounty hunter, trying to dissuade him from entering the house. While they were distracted, Conthi, seeing his opportunity, slipped out of the barn and darted towards the back of the house, staying low to the ground. Sarah saw him and subtly nodded, hoping he understood her plan. He slipped inside the back door just as the bounty hunter finally pushed Sarah aside and stormed into the house, his men following close behind. The search had begun. The bounty hunters systematically searched the small house, overturning furniture, rummaging through drawers, their movements violent and intrusive. Sarah followed them, her heart pounding in her chest, praying that Conthi had found a good hiding place. They were about to give up when one of the men opened the door to the small storage room off the kitchen. Conthi was there, cornered, his eyes blazing with defiance. The bounty hunter raised his rifle, ready to fire. "No!" Sarah screamed, throwing herself in front of Conthi. "Don't shoot. He's my husband." The bounty hunters froze, their faces a mixture of surprise and disbelief. "Your husband?" The leader scoffed. "That's an Apache." "He is now," Sarah said, her voice trembling but firm. She reached out and took Conthi's hand, her touch surprisingly gentle. "We were married just a few weeks ago. It was a small ceremony, just the 2 of us. We haven't told anyone yet." She knew it was a long shot, a desperate gamble. But she remembered a law she had once heard about, a rarely used provision that protected married couples from interference, even if one of them was an outlaw. It was designed to prevent domestic violence, but it could also be used to protect a spouse from unjust prosecution. The bounty hunter narrowed his eyes, skeptical. "I don't believe you," he said. "Show me proof." Sarah's mind raced. She had no proof, no marriage certificate, no witnesses. All she had was her word and the determination to protect Conthi at any cost. She looked into Conthi's eyes and saw a flicker of understanding, a glimmer of hope. He squeezed her hand tightly, a silent promise of support. Taking a deep breath, she said, "I have no proof except my word. But in this territory, a woman's word is her bond. And I swear, before God and man, that Conthi is my husband." The air hung thick with tension, the fate of both Sarah and Conthi hanging in the balance. The leader of the bounty hunters studied Sarah's face, searching for any sign of deception. He glanced at Conthi, who stood silent and watchful, his expression unreadable. The tension in the small house was palpable. Finally, the bounty hunter sighed. "All right, widow," he said, his voice grudging. "I don't believe a word you're saying, but I can't prove otherwise. And I ain't about to break the law over some Injun." He turned to his men. "Let's go," he said. "There's nothing for us here." The bounty hunters grumbled, but they followed their leader out of the house, their eyes lingering on Sarah and Conthi with suspicion and resentment. Sarah watched them go, her breath catching in her throat with relief. She had done it. She had saved Conthi. As the sound of the horses faded into the distance, Sarah turned to Conthi, her legs weak with exhaustion. He was staring at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his touch surprisingly tender. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why you do this?" Sarah didn't know how to explain it. She had acted on instinct, driven by a sense of compassion and a desire to protect someone in need. She had risked everything for a man she barely knew, a man who was considered her enemy. "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. I couldn't let them kill you." Kanthi nodded slowly, his eyes searching hers. He understood the risk she had taken, the sacrifice she had made. He knew that she had saved his life, and he would never forget it. The bounty hunters might have left, acknowledging the claimed marriage, but Sarah knew that her troubles were far from over. She had lied to protect Kanthi, but her lie had created a whole new set of problems. She was now bound to him, not by love, but by a desperate act of selflessness that had changed her life forever. Silence hung heavy in the air between them, thick with unspoken words and uncertain futures. Sarah busied herself tidying the house, straightening overturned furniture, trying to ignore the weight of Kanthi's gaze. She knew he was waiting for her to speak, to explain, to somehow make sense of the impossible situation they now found themselves in. Finally, Kanthi broke the silence. "I must speak with my people," he said, his voice low and solemn. "What you did, it changes things." Sarah stopped her cleaning, her heart sinking. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that they could simply forget what had happened, that Kanthi would leave and she could return to her solitary life. But she knew, deep down, that it wasn't that simple. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kanthi stood tall, his eyes filled with a fierce pride. "In my culture," he said, "honor is everything. You risked your life to save mine. You claimed me as your husband, knowing the consequences. My people believe that such a sacrifice demands a response." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of response?" she asked, dread creeping into her voice. Kanthi hesitated, his expression troubled. "Apache tradition dictates that I must now marry you." Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. She had pretended to be his wife to save his life, but she never expected it to become a reality. "Marry me?" she repeated, her voice incredulous. "But that's impossible. We don't even know each other. We come from different worlds." Kanthi nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet sadness. "I know," he said, "but honor demands it. I cannot allow your sacrifice to go unacknowledged. My people would never forgive me." Sarah felt trapped, caught in a web of circumstances beyond her control. She had saved Kanthi's life, but in doing so, she had unwittingly bound herself to him in a way she never could have imagined. Her desperate lie had become a binding obligation, a cultural imperative that threatened to shatter her carefully constructed world. The days that followed were strained and awkward. Kanthi, true to his word, made preparations to formalize their union according to Apache custom. He crafted a simple ring from silver he had scavenged, a symbol of his commitment. Sarah, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile herself to the idea of marrying a man she barely knew, a man from a culture so different from her own. They slept in separate beds, their interactions polite but distant. The farmhouse, once a haven of solitude for Sarah, now felt cramped and confining, filled with unspoken tension. They tried to navigate their new reality, but the cultural differences were stark and unyielding. Kanthi, accustomed to a nomadic lifestyle, found it difficult to adjust to the routines of farm life. He didn't understand Sarah's meticulous planning, her constant labor to cultivate the land. He preferred to hunt and gather, relying on the bounty of nature, a way of life that Sarah found unpredictable and unsustainable. Sarah, in turn, struggled to understand Kanthi's stoicism, his quiet intensity. She was used to open communication, to sharing her thoughts and feelings freely. Kanthi, however, kept his emotions guarded, revealing little of his inner world. The lack of genuine affection was perhaps the most difficult challenge. They respected each other, even admired each other in some ways, but there was no spark of love, no shared history, no emotional connection to bind them together. They were strangers, forced into a marriage of convenience, struggling to find common ground in a world that seemed determined to keep them apart. Sarah began to question her decision to save Conthi. Had she made a mistake? Had she doomed herself to a life of unhappiness and isolation? She longed for the comfort and familiarity of her old life, but she knew that there was no going back. She had made a commitment, and she would honor it, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness. The forced marriage felt like a heavy burden, a constant reminder of the desperate choice she had made to save a life. Despite the difficulties, small shifts began to occur. Sarah, watching Conthi interact with the land, saw a deep connection to nature that she had never fully understood. He spoke of the Apache's dwindling resources, the broken treaties, the forced displacement from their ancestral lands. She began to understand that the raids were not acts of senseless violence, but desperate attempts to survive, to protect their way of life. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Conthi told her about his family, about his younger sister who had died from starvation after their hunting ground were taken over by settlers. He spoke of his anger, his frustration, his determination to fight for his people. Sarah listened, her heart aching with sympathy. She began to see him not as a savage raider, but as a man driven by love and loyalty, fighting for what he believed in. Conthi, in turn, began to appreciate Sarah's strength and compassion. He saw how hard she worked to maintain the farm, how she cared for her animals, how she always had a kind word for her neighbors, even those who treated her with suspicion. He admired her resilience, her unwavering determination to overcome adversity. He watched her tend to her garden, coaxing life from the dry earth, and he saw a reflection of his own people's connection to the land. He realized that she, too, was fighting for survival, struggling to build a life in a harsh and unforgiving world. He began to see her not as a white settler, but as a fellow human being, facing similar challenges and driven by similar hopes. He saw her kindness in the way she treated the injured animals she sometimes found on the farm, nursing them back to health with gentle care. He understood that she had a deep capacity for compassion, a willingness to help those in need, regardless of their background. Slowly, tentatively, they began to see each other not as enemies, but as individuals, bound together by circumstance, finding common ground in their shared humanity. The uneasy truce they had forged was shattered one moonless night. The distant yelps of coyotes were replaced by the more sinister war cries Sarah remembered from the first raid. She bolted upright in bed, her heart pounding. Conthi was already awake, listening intently, his face grim. "They come," he said, his voice low and urgent. "My people." Sarah's fear returned, sharp and cold. Another raid. This time, it was her farm that was threatened. She looked at Conthi, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and accusation. Would he protect her, or would he side with his people? Conthi saw the question in her eyes. He understood the impossible choice he faced. Loyalty to his tribe, to his family, versus his growing feelings for Sarah, his honor-bound commitment to protect her. He walked to the window and peered out into the darkness. The sound of the raid were growing closer, the smell of smoke heavy in the air. "I must go," he said, his voice filled with anguish. "I must try to stop them, to reason with them." Sarah grabbed his arm. "You can't go out there," she cried. "They'll kill you. And what about me? What about the farm?" Conthi turned to her, his eyes filled with pain. "I don't know," he said. "I don't know what to do. My heart is torn in two." He knew that the raid was likely led by members of his own band, driven to desperation by hunger and the loss of their lands. He knew that they would see him as a traitor if he stood against them. But he also knew that he could not stand by and watch them destroy Sarah's home, her livelihood. He had made a commitment to protect her, and he would honor it, even if it meant sacrificing his own life. He pulled away from Sarah, his face set with determination. "I will try to reason with them," he said. "But if they will not listen, I will defend you. I will defend this farm." He grabbed his knife and slipped out into the darkness, leaving Sarah alone to face her fears. The sounds of the raid grew louder, closer, the fate of Sarah and Conthi hanging in the balance. Sarah didn't wait for Conthi to return. Grabbing Thomas's rifle, she braced herself against the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The first of the raiders appeared, shadowy figures emerging from the darkness, their faces painted with war paint, their eyes filled with a fierce determination. Before they could reach the house, Conthi appeared, stepping between them and Sarah, his voice ringing out in their native tongue. He pleaded with them, arguing with them, trying to dissuade them from attacking. But they wouldn't listen. They saw him as a traitor, a turncoat who had abandoned his people for a white woman. One of the raiders, a tall, muscular warrior with a scar across his face, stepped forward. "You have chosen your side, Conthi," he said, his voice filled with scorn. "Now you must face the consequences." He raised his spear, ready to strike. Conthi stood his ground, his knife glinting in the moonlight. Sarah knew that he couldn't fight them all. She had to do something. She raised her rifle and fired a shot into the air. The sound echoed through the night, startling the raiders. They turned to see Sarah standing on the porch, her rifle pointed directly at them. "Get off my land," she shouted, her voice trembling but firm. "Leave now or I'll shoot." The raiders hesitated, their eyes flickering between Sarah and Conthi. They had not expected her to fight. They had underestimated her. Conthi seized the opportunity. He lunged at the warrior with the scar, engaging him in hand-to-hand combat. Sarah fired another shot, hitting one of the raiders in the leg. The others scattered, seeking cover behind the trees and bushes. The battle had begun. Sarah and Conthi fought side by side, defending the farm against the onslaught of the raiders. Conthi moved with a speed and agility that Sarah had never seen before, his knife a blur of motion. Sarah, though less skilled, was a crack shot, her rifle finding its mark with deadly accuracy. Together, they formed a formidable defense, their determination fueled by love, loyalty, and a desperate desire to survive. Conthi had made his choice, and his actions spoke louder than any words. He was with Sarah, and he would fight to protect her and her home. The fighting lasted for what felt like an eternity. The air was filled with the crack of gunfire, the clash of steel, and the cries of the wounded. Slowly but surely, Sarah and Conthi began to gain the upper hand. The raiders, realizing that they were outmatched, eventually retreated back into the darkness, leaving behind their dead and wounded. As the last of the raiders disappeared, Sarah collapsed against the doorframe, her body trembling with exhaustion. Conthi rushed to her side, his face etched with concern. "Sarah, are you all right?" Sarah nodded, her voice hoarse. "I'm fine," she said. "But you're hurt." She saw the blood seeping through his shirt, staining his skin a dark crimson. He had been wounded again, this time in the leg. Conthi dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "It is nothing," he said, "just a scratch." But Sarah wouldn't let him brush it aside. She helped him inside the house and carefully examined the wound. It was deep and painful, but thankfully not life-threatening. She cleaned the wound with water and herbs, just as she had done before, her touch gentle and sure. As she tended to his injuries, she felt a surge of emotion, a deep and profound love for this man who had risked everything to protect her. She had seen his courage, his loyalty, his unwavering commitment to her. She knew that she could never. News of the raid spread quickly through the small community. At first, the settlers were wary, fearful of what it meant to have an Apache living among them. They had always viewed the Apache as enemies, as savages who threatened their way of life. But as they learned more about what had happened, their attitudes began to change. They heard how Conthi had stood against his own people to protect Sarah and her farm. They saw the wounds he had suffered, the sacrifices he had made. They witnessed Sarah's unwavering commitment to him, her tireless efforts to nurse him back to health. They saw, too, the devastation the raid had caused, the broken fences, the ruined crops, the fear in Sarah's eyes. The Millers, Sarah's closest neighbors, were the first to offer their help. They brought food and supplies, offering their assistance in repairing the damage. Others followed, slowly but surely, their initial hostility replaced by a grudging respect. They began to see that Sarah and Conthi were not so different from them. They were just two people trying to survive in a harsh and unforgiving world. They had faced adversity, they had shown courage, and they had demonstrated a willingness to help each other, regardless of their differences. The community began to accept the unusual couple, recognizing that their love and loyalty transcended cultural boundaries. They saw Kanthi not as an Apache raider, but as a man of honor, a protector, a valuable member of their community. They saw Sarah not as a foolish woman who had fallen for an enemy, but as a strong and compassionate woman who had dared to challenge their prejudices. The shift in attitude wasn't universal, of course. There were still those who viewed Kanthi with suspicion and distrust. But the majority of the community had come to accept them, offering them their support and friendship. Sarah and Kanthi had proven that love and understanding could conquer even the deepest divisions, that even the most unlikely of couples could find a place in their hearts and in their community. As Kanthi recovered from his wounds, a new warmth filled the farmhouse. The awkwardness that had once defined their relationship began to fade, replaced by a comfortable intimacy. They spent hours talking, sharing stories, laughing together. They learned to appreciate each other's strengths, to support each other's weaknesses. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Sarah turned to Kanthi, her heart overflowing with love. "Kanthi," she said, her voice soft and tender. I think I'm falling in love with you." Kanthi's eyes widened with surprise, then softened with affection. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands. "I think I'm falling in love with you too, Sarah," he said, his voice filled with emotion. They gazed into each other's eyes, their hearts connecting in a way that transcended language and culture. They realized that their forced marriage had blossomed into something real, something beautiful, something they never could have imagined. The love that had grown between them was not based on obligation or duty, but on a deep and profound connection, a shared understanding, a mutual respect. They embraced their bodies. Their newfound happiness was tinged with a lingering sadness. Kanthi knew that he could not fully embrace his new life with Sarah until he had made peace with his tribe. He had to explain his choices, to justify his actions, to seek their understanding. He prepared for his journey, gathering supplies and saying goodbye to Sarah. She watched him go, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and fear. She knew that this journey was necessary, that Kanthi needed to reconnect with his roots, to find closure. But she also worried about his safety, about the possibility that he would never return. Kanthi traveled for many days, following the ancient trails that led to his people's hidden encampment. When he arrived, he was met with suspicion and hostility. The warriors greeted him with scorn, accusing him of betraying their cause. The women looked at him with sadness, lamenting the loss of a brother. Kanthi spoke to them with honesty and sincerity, explaining his reasons for staying with Sarah. He told them about her kindness, her compassion, her unwavering commitment to him. He told them about the love that had grown between them, a love that transcended cultural boundaries. He explained that he could not stand by and watch them destroy her home, her livelihood. He told them that he had made a commitment to protect her, and that he would honor that commitment, even if it meant sacrificing his own life. He spoke of the need for peace, for understanding, for a new way forward. He urged them to abandon the raids, to seek a peaceful coexistence with the settlers. He knew that it was a long shot, but he had to try. To his surprise, some of the younger warriors listened to him, their hearts touched by his words. They saw the love in his eyes, the sincerity in his voice. They began to understand that there might be another way, a way to. Kanthi returned to Sarah, his face etched with a quiet peace. He had not convinced all of his people, but he had planted a seed of hope, a glimmer of understanding that might one day blossom into lasting peace. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was no longer alone. He had Sarah by his side, and together they could face any challenge. Kanthi learned to appreciate the rhythms of farm life, working alongside Sarah in the fields, tending to the animals. Sarah, in turn, learned about the Apache traditions, about the beauty of the land, about the importance of family and community. They taught each other their languages, sharing stories and songs, bridging the gap between their cultures. They welcomed visitors to their farm, sharing their food and their hospitality, demonstrating that love and understanding could conquer even the deepest divisions. The community continued to support them, offering their friendship and their assistance. They saw in Sarah and Kanthi a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of love to heal old wounds and build a better future. Years passed, and Sarah and Kanthi's love grew stronger with each passing day. They built a home filled with laughter and joy, a sanctuary of peace and understanding. They raised a family, teaching their children about their heritage, about the importance of respecting all cultures, about the power of love to transform the world. They proved that it was possible to bridge two different worlds, to overcome prejudice and hatred, to build a future based on love, respect, and understanding. Their story became a legend, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope can always blossom and love can always find a way.